There's a rhythm in history, a pulse that beats beneath every empire, every flag, every anthem that once swore it would last forever. You can hear it echoing through the centuries, a pattern of rise, corruption, collapse, and chaos. It's not random, it's mathematical, predictable, cold. 3 times in the last 250 years, this pattern has brought down nations that believed they were untouchable. France in 1789, Russia in 1917, Cuba in 1959, each believed they were stable. Each fell in almost the same sequence, step by step, grievance by grievance, as if history itself were reading from a blood-stained script. Now in the year 2025, the same rhythm beats again. The United States, the world's most powerful republic, is following the same 6-stage cycle, and we are already deep into it. The signs are everywhere: rising inequality, government decay, public fury, and a loss of faith in every institution once considered sacred. Like France before the guillotine, like Russia before the barricades, like Cuba before the fires, America stands at stage 4. But this isn't a prophecy. It's a pattern carved into human nature itself, the story of how power blinds, how privilege deafens, and how a nation forgets the sound of its own breaking. The question isn't if the next revolution comes. The question is how close we are to lighting the fuse. Before we trace the path of collapse, we need to understand what a revolution truly is. Not the word printed in history books or shouted in the streets, but the reality that consumes nations whole. A revolution isn't a protest. It isn't reform. It's extinction, the complete destruction of the old order and the violent birth of something entirely new, often something far worse. Revolutions don't erupt because people are poor. Poverty has always existed. They ignite when expectations exceed reality, when citizens begin to believe they deserve more than what the system will ever give. When promises fail, when justice feels like a privilege, and when hope turns to hunger, the social contract snaps. And once that bond breaks, once the people stop believing the system can fix itself, the countdown begins. Governments think they have time. They tell themselves the anger is temporary, that protests will fade, that order will return. But history disagrees. From the Palace of Versailles to the Winter Palace in Russia, from the casinos of Havana to the cities of America today, the pattern is always the same. As John F. Kennedy once warned, those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. His words weren't theory, they were prophecy. Every empire that refused to reform met the same end. And so we look back to the first great explosion of the modern age. France, 1789. The nation that defined civilization would soon define collapse. In 1789, France was the jewel of Europe, elegant, cultured, and powerful. Its cities gleamed with art and intellect. Its court glimmered beneath chandeliers of gold. To the world, it seemed eternal. But beneath that glittering surface, rot had already set in. The kingdom's heart was dying quietly, slowly, under the weight of its own excess. Stage 1: extreme wealth inequality. 27 million souls divided into 3 estates. The clergy and nobility, less than 2%, owned more than 1/3 of all the land and paid almost nothing in taxes. The rest, the peasants, the workers, the rising middle class, carried everything. When harvests failed and bread prices doubled, families starved while nobles feasted. The contrast wasn't just economic, it was moral, spiritual, a chasm between those who ruled and those who bled. Stage 2: government corruption and incompetence. King Louis XVI wasn't cruel, he was paralyzed. The treasury emptied the country, drowning in debt from endless wars, and his solution was to borrow more, tax more, and hope for a miracle. But the privileged refused to sacrifice. The nobility blocked reform. The clergy clung to their exemptions. The state, once divine, became a hollow theater of denial. Stage 3: the middle class destroyed and radicalized. Lawyers, merchants, and thinkers, those who once supported the monarchy, turned against it. When Louis called the Estates General, they demanded equality. When he refused, they formed the National Assembly and swore not to disband until France had a constitution. Their rebellion wasn't born from hunger, but from betrayal. They had believed in the system until the system spat them out. Then came the spark. July 14th, 1789. The Bastille fell. The people surged through the streets carrying pikes, torches, and fury. The king's authority shattered in an instant. Stage 4: loss of faith in institutions. The monarchy, the church, the courts, all exposed as instruments of injustice. France was no longer a kingdom, it was a storm. Stage 5: the revolutionary movement gains mass support. The Jacobins rose, led by men like Robespierre, men who believed that purity could only be forged in blood. The moderates were swept away. The guillotine became both symbol and solution. January 21st, 1793, King Louis XVI was executed. 9 months later, his queen followed. Stage 6. Government overthrown. Chaos follows. The terror consumed France. 40,000 executed. Streets ran red as citizens accused one another to survive a day longer. Revolution devoured its own children. Robespierre himself met the blade he once commanded. And when the fires dimmed from the ashes, rose a soldier Napoleon. The revolution that began with liberty, equality, fraternity ended with an emperor and 15 years of war. France had completed the cycle from splendor to starvation, from freedom to tyranny. And history had learned a new rhythm, one it would play again and again. A century after France, the pattern reawakened, this time in the frozen heart of an empire. Russia, 1917. A land vast enough to swallow Europe whole, ruled by a dynasty that believed itself chosen by God. For 300 years, the Romanovs had stood unshaken. Yet as winter gripped the land, their empire was already cracking beneath its own arrogance. Stage 1. Extreme wealth inequality. The Tsar and his nobles lived in palaces gilded with chandeliers, while peasants, nearly 80% of the population, owned nothing but their hunger. They had been freed from serfdom in name, but not in life, still paying rent to lords, still bound by debt and despair. In the factories of St. Petersburg, men, women, and children worked 14-hour days for starvation wages. While the elite danced at midnight balls, the people froze beneath their shadows. Stage 2. Government corruption and incompetence. Nicholas II was not a tyrant of cruelty but of delusion. He believed in divine right, that his crown was sanctified, that reform would offend heaven. He ruled as if time itself could be ordered to stop. When his people marched peacefully to plead for bread, his soldiers opened fire. Hundreds died on the snow that day. Bloody Sunday, the moment faith in the Tsar shattered forever. Then came World War I. Millions sent to the front lines with no boots, no rifles, no hope. The empire that stretched across continents could not feed or arm its own army. By 1917, Russia had lost 3 million men. And still Nicholas sat in luxury, listening not to generals but to Rasputin, a mystic whose whispers drowned an empire. Stage 3. The middle class and military turn against the throne. In February, riots erupted in Petrograd. Soldiers were ordered to fire, but they refused. They joined the crowds instead. When the army sides with the streets, the crown has already fallen. The Tsar abdicated, ending 3 centuries of Romanov rule. For a brief moment, it seemed Russia might find reform. The provisional government promised democracy and then made its fatal mistake, keeping the country in the war. Stage 4. Loss of faith in institutions. The government starved while pretending to lead. Factories closed, hunger spread, and soldiers deserted in droves. Into that vacuum stepped a name that would haunt the century: Lenin. Stage 5. The revolutionary movement gains mass support. His message was cruelly simple: peace, land, bread. In a country starving and broken, those 3 words were worth more than any constitution. The Bolsheviks seized power in October 1917 almost without resistance, and then the killing began. Stage 6. Government overthrown. Chaos follows. The civil war that followed turned the vast empire into a graveyard. The Red Army against the White Brother against brother. Villages erased. Millions dead. The Tsar and his family shot in a basement, their bodies burned, their children bayoneted. The revolution that had promised mercy delivered only iron. By 1922, Lenin ruled over a wasteland, a new state born of terror. The Soviet Union would rise from those ashes, but the soul of Russia never recovered. What began as liberation ended in dictatorship. What began with bread ended in silence. The pattern had repeated not across centuries, but across human nature itself. 70 years after the Russian Empire fell, the pattern resurfaced, this time under a tropical sun. Cuba, 1950s. A paradise of music, neon lights, and American money. Havana shimmered like a jewel in the Caribbean, its casinos overflowing with champagne, its streets humming with Cadillacs and mambo rhythms. To tourists, it looked like a dream. But beneath the glitter, something rotten pulsed. Stage 1. Extreme wealth inequality. Havana's wealth gleamed in the night, but outside the city, farmers tilled dust. The sugar plantations owned by American corporations drained the island's lifeblood. A handful of elites and foreign investors grew fat, while the countryside sank into hunger and illiteracy. The same nation, two realities, one soaked in luxury, the other in despair. Stage 2. Government corruption and incompetence. President Fulgencio Batista had once promised reform, then seized power in a coup and sold the nation piece by piece. The police were his enforcers, the judges, his puppets. Opposition voices vanished in the dark. Torture, bribery, and fear became the gears of his rule. The government existed not to lead, but to loot. And as always, oppression breeds rage. Stage 3. The middle class radicalized. Into this world stepped a young lawyer, Fidel Castro. Educated, articulate, idealistic. He could have joined the elite, but chose instead to fight it. His failed uprising in 1953 turned him into a symbol. At his trial, he spoke words that would echo across the island. "History will absolve me." He was imprisoned, released, exiled, then returned in secret with 82 men and a dream of revolution. Stage 4. Loss of faith in institutions. Batista's brutality transformed him from ruler to villain. Every act of repression only swelled the rebel ranks. When his army burned villages, peasants became soldiers. When students were tortured, universities became battlefields. The United States, embarrassed by its allies' cruelty, withdrew support, and Batista's power began to crumble. Stage 5. The revolutionary movement gains mass support. Castro's guerrillas descended from the Sierra Maestra mountains like ghosts. By 1958, they had captured the imagination of the nation. The cities erupted in strikes, the countryside rose in rebellion, and Batista's army disintegrated. On New Year's Day 1959, the dictator fled with his fortune, and Castro rode into Havana as a hero. Stage 6. Government overthrown. Chaos follows. The celebration didn't last. Within months, the new regime revealed its true face. Political opponents were executed in public squares. Newspapers silenced. Businesses seized. Castro nationalized everything, land factories, hope itself. The revolution that promised freedom became a cage that lasted 60 years. The music faded, the lights dimmed, paradise burned. 3 revolutions, 3 centuries, 3 nations that believed they were different, and each fell into the same 6-stage descent. Wealth inequality, corruption, the fall of the middle class, the loss of faith, the rise of radicals, and finally collapse. The pattern was now complete, and history, it seemed, had written its rulebook. History doesn't repeat it, rhymes with ruthless precision. When we line these revolutions side by side, a chilling symmetry emerges. Each nation separated by centuries and oceans moved through the same 6 phases like clockwork, the anatomy of collapse. Stage 1. Extreme wealth inequality. In every case, the top 1% hoarded between a quarter and half of all wealth. In France, the clergy and nobles floated above the hunger of millions. In Russia, the Tsar and his court drowned in luxury, while peasants starved in their fields. In Cuba, Batista and his foreign patrons turned the island into a playground for the rich. Inequality alone doesn't destroy a nation, but it builds the foundation of rage. When privilege becomes visible, when wealth becomes obscene, resentment stops being silent. Stage 2. Government corruption and incompetence. When power stops serving the people and begins serving itself, the system turns hollow. France's monarchy refused reform. Russia's Tsar ruled through mystics and delusion. Cuba's dictator sold his country to the highest bidder. The elite never see it coming, not because they're blind, but because they choose to be. Stage 3. The middle class destroyed and radicalized. The revolution always begins with those who believed in the system: lawyers, merchants, teachers, students. When they lose faith, the government loses its foundation. They are the bridge between the rulers and the ruled, and when that bridge collapses, chaos crosses freely. Stage 4. Loss of faith in institutions. Elections, courts, police, press. Once these lose legitimacy, nothing stands between order and anarchy. People stop believing the rules matter. Truth becomes partisan, justice becomes optional, and the law becomes a weapon wielded by whoever seizes it first. Stage 5. The revolutionary movement gains mass support. Every system breeds its own destroyers. France had the Jacobins, Russia, the Bolsheviks, Cuba, the 26th of July movement. Each began as the voice of justice, each promised renewal, and each unleashed a storm that could not be contained. Stage 6. Government overthrown. Chaos follows. The old order collapses, heads fall, flags burn, streets run red, and in the smoke of revolution new tyrants rise. The promise of freedom dissolves into fear. This is the six-stage blueprint, the rhythm of collapse. It's not ideology, it's not coincidence, it's the mathematics of decay. And every nation that ignores it eventually hears the same sound, the echo of its own history calling from the future. Now the pattern turns its gaze to us. The stage is not Versailles or Petrograd or Havana, it's Washington, D.C., it's New York, Los Angeles. Every city in a country that once called itself invincible. The names have changed, but the symptoms are the same. America, 2025, a nation proud, powerful, fractured, and deaf to its own warnings. Stage 1: extreme wealth inequality. 40 years ago, the top 1% owned 8% of the nation's wealth. Today, they hold more than 32%. The top 0.1%, about 130,000 households, control more than the bottom 90% combined. Billionaires build rockets to escape Earth while millions can't afford rent. The middle class, once the spine of the republic, is collapsing into debt and despair. The rage is not hidden anymore. It's everywhere, in protests and politics, in the quiet resentment of people who work 3 jobs and still can't breathe. Stage 2: government corruption and incompetence. Trust in Congress sits near 15%. Scandals have become background noise. Insider trading, lobbyists writing laws, trillion-dollar debts with no accountability. The people no longer believe their leaders act in good faith, and they're not wrong. Infrastructure crumbles, healthcare bankrupts, promises decay in committees. When the government no longer governs, it merely performs a hollow ritual to preserve the illusion of control. Stage 3: the middle class destroyed and radicalized. For generations, Americans believed hard work would guarantee a future. That myth is dying. Students drown in loans, families lose homes, parents skip medicine to feed their children. These aren't the poorest, these are the educated, the capable, the ones who were told the system would reward them. Now they're angry. And anger, when educated, becomes dangerous. Stage 4: loss of faith in institutions. This is where we are now. Trust in media at record lows. Trust in police divided along political lines. Trust in elections shattered. Half the country believes the 2020 vote was stolen. The other half believes democracy was attacked from within. Courts are seen as partisan, the FBI as corrupt, the press as propaganda. The idea of a shared reality, the foundation of any nation, has crumbled. We have become 2 countries sharing one flag, 2 truths sharing one lie. The lines of division are no longer invisible. They are drawn in blood and belief. And history tells us what comes next. Stage 5. The rise of revolutionary movements is forming in the distance. The left and the right both whisper the same dangerous words: the system cannot be saved. And when enough people believe that the pattern will advance swiftly, violently, inevitably. America is standing at the same precipice France, Russia, and Cuba once faced. Stage 4 is not the end. It's the last warning before the fall. Stage 6. The final act. The moment when the fabric tears, when history stops whispering and starts to scream. No one ever believes it can happen. Not the kings, not the commissars, not the presidents. They all think their system is different, that their laws are stronger, their people more civilized, their democracy more permanent. But when trust dies, when truth fractures, when every conversation becomes a battlefield, the storm begins. No one can say exactly how it will unfold. Perhaps it starts with an election. No one accepts a leader who refuses to step down, or a protest that turns into a fire that spreads faster than reason. Maybe it begins in the streets, maybe in the markets, maybe in the minds of millions who simply stop believing in tomorrow. The signs are already here: anger without direction, loyalty without principle, violence without restraint. And once the pattern reaches its final stage, history shows what follows. Political violence stops being spontaneous, it becomes organized. Assassinations sabotage uprisings. Soldiers divided by allegiance, police choosing sides. The economy collapses under panic, supply chains. Break food and fuel vanish. States threaten secession. Militias form borders of their own, and foreign powers wait like vultures above the storm. In France, it was the guillotine. In Russia, firing squads and famine. In Cuba, decades of dictatorship. For America, no one knows the shape of its darkness yet, but the equation is the same. Chaos is the debt every empire pays when arrogance becomes policy and division becomes identity. Still, there is a fleeting chance, a narrow window before the fall. Patterns can be broken, but only by awareness, by unity, by the courage to reform before collapse demands revolution. History has no mercy for those who ignore its warnings. Yet it has always offered a single grace, the ability to see what's coming and to choose differently. The storm is not destiny, it's a mirror. What we see in it depends on what we become before it breaks. History is not a collection of dates. It's a warning carved into the bones of civilizations. France, Russia, Cuba, each believed they were immune to collapse. Each believed their greatness was eternal, and each was wrong. Every empire writes the same tragedy, arrogance in the first act, denial in the second, and ruin in the third. The characters change, the language changes, but the ending is always written in blood. Look closely and you'll see the reflection. The same cracks forming in our own walls, the same complacency in our leaders, the same exhaustion in our people. Every revolution begins with a whisper, not a scream. Every fall begins with a shrug, not a battle cry. And once the spiral starts, once the pattern awakens, it consumes everything: belief, order, memory. The United States is not fated to burn, but history has made its position clear. The numbers, the rage, the silence all align with the fourth stage. The fifth is forming. The sixth waits in the dark. And the pattern, that cold, merciless rhythm, never misses a beat. They thought they were different. France thought so, Russia thought so, Cuba thought so, and now we think so. But history doesn't care about exceptions. It only cares about consequences. If what you've heard tonight opened your eyes, remember this. Revolutions are not born in the future. They are born in the present, in apathy and inequality and silence. So when the next stage begins, when the streets tremble and the headlines blur, you will understand what is happening and why. The answers were never hidden in tomorrow. They were written long ago in the past.